Well, good morning, everyone. And welcome all to Crawford School of Public Policy at the ANU. It's a real pleasure to have you all with us this morning. My name's Helen Sullivan, and I have the great privilege of being the director of Crawford, and also the great privilege of introducing today's very special speaker and chairing the discussion. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the land of the Ngunnawal people, and extend my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Today, the Australian National University is honoured to have Her Excellency Dr Sri Mulyani Indrawati on campus. She is a woman who, in a time where women leaders seem to be disappearing from our global politics, she is a woman who has managed to achieve some of the highest offices in international affairs. Her Excellency Indrawati has been Indonesia's finance minister since 2016 under President Joko Widodo, and in the same position under President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono from 2005 to 2010. So some serious staying power. She has also held exceptional positions outside Indonesia as an executive director on the board of the International Monetary Fund and managing director of the World Bank Group. We have too few women of that who occupy those positions at present, and it is always a great honour for me to be able to introduce those who have achieved so much. And those of you students in the audience who are hoping to achieve something similar, I think this is going to be an object lesson in the kind of expertise and qualities you need to achieve so much. Dr Indrawati has been a friend of the ANU Indonesia project for many, many years. And at this point, I'd like to acknowledge the director of the Indonesia project, Blaine Lewis, who has done so much to develop the project since taking on the role about 18 months ago. Dr Indrawati first presented at the Indonesia Update in 1997 and spoke at a range of Indonesia project events. Notably, she saw the importance of having a frank dialogue between Australia and Indonesia policymakers and academics, and help to establish the now ongoing high policy level dialogue in Jakarta, which is now the Indonesia project's flagship annual event. In keeping with her generous commitment to the ANU and to the Indonesia project, Dr Indrawati is making a wide range of visits and meetings, and this one day she is with us, both with staff, students and colleagues. So those of you lucky enough to be in this room, let me assure you this is only one of many events that she is attending. Last week's airline crash was a shocking accident. On behalf of the ANU, we would like to offer our condolences to all those affected, particularly in the Ministry of Finance, Dr Indrawati's ministry, who lost many staff in that accident. Dr Indrawati will be speaking to us today on the theme of human capital development in the digitalisation era, something that preoccupies all of us concerned with public policy and public administration, and something which I have no doubt she will have many important things to share. She will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we will have time for Q&A. So those of you keen to ask questions, there will be an opportunity to do so. But before we get to that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Indrawati to the stage.
Good morning to all of you. It's really a pleasure for me to be back here again. As you all know, a couple of years ago I was here in my different capacity as a managing director of the World Bank. So and as mentioned by Helen, which is giving all of us a very complete my interaction with ANU as Australia since 97, so it's always good to be back here in Canberra as well as ANU. I'm going to speak today about the human capital as a key in reducing poverty and addressing inequality, but now facing a much daunting question about how we are going to prepare human capital in a digitalization era. Discussing quite a lot about the world is going to change with this technology. And I'm going to divide the topic today into three areas. The first is the Indonesia economy and the structural change that we have in the past, especially 2 decades, but even if you look at before, to give the understanding of how we changed and where we are today. And the challenge in the next. And then the second topic is how the digital economy provides both opportunity and a challenge. And the third part of my discussion this morning is on what is the policy in the future, how we as a government try to respond to that, working together with industries, economies, academicians. So let me start with the first topic about where we are. Indonesia, as an economy, developing and then become emerging economy, we actually growing quite robustly. In the past more than 18 years, we were growing at a pace of 5.28%. Poverty has been reduced, and the first time in the history of Indonesia, we are now at the single-digit poverty level, 9.8%. We also, at some point, suffering from increasing economy, growing, but also followed by the widening gap between the rich and poor, which is measured by the Gini coefficient. Our Gini coefficient reached the highest 0.41% in 2010. Since then, since the previous president as well as current president, working hard to try to correct those direction which is not favorable and can become a threat for not only economic progress, but also can be also a threat for the political stability, the widening gap. So today we see that the Gini ratio has been declined into 0.38. It's the right direction, it's a consistent, which is we continue want to make sure that this is going to create more opportunity, especially for the 40% bottom of demography. Unemployment as of today is at the 5.13%. This is also the lowest since 2 decades ago. So Indonesian economy situation is actually quite sound and favorable. What is the challenge that we are having? If we look at the momentum of growth, especially in the past 2 decades, it's always the commodity price contributing to what you call it upside and downside to the economy. It's not exception in 2014, we hit by this declining very rapidly the commodity price. That's also pressuring our economy. But the recovery has been seen since 2017, especially the second half, and continue until today in 2018. If we look at the Indonesia in a much longer time frame, you also see the change on the economic structure, which is giving us what we need to address, what we have already achieved and what we need to address. One which is very significant shift in the Indonesian economy, especially if you are a follower of the Indonesian economic development since 1970. We first changing the composition of the economy from mostly primary balance-driven economy, primary sector-driven economy, especially on the mining as well as agriculture, to become a secondary sector-driven economy, which is mainly manufacturing and construction. That was also followed by the urbanization during President Suharto's time in almost 3 decades. Since we suffered the economic crisis in 97-98, which you see in the previous graph Indonesia have a drop or contraction very deeply in terms of the economic performance, minus 13%. Since then, the structure of the economy has not returned to the previous path. What we see today is actually a shifting on a structure of economy which is mostly dominated by more services sector. It can be interpreted good or maybe less good. I'm not using bad in this case. So I'm become political now. Okay. So since 2000, after the 97-98 crisis, the very rapid growth of the services sector is actually giving, in the good interpretation, more and more labor force, which is more educated and skilled, they are shifting directly into the service sector. And that creates a contribution productivity and a much higher portion or share to our GDP. But if you interpret it in the less good of this phenomena, the manufacturing sector in Indonesia is actually stagnant in terms of the contribution to the economy. This is especially since after 97-98. It's plateauing, the next graph, since 2001, and continue in that, and then even declining if you look at since 2009. The GDP per employment is increasing for productive manufacturing, but this is only a very few segments. Manufacturing is always a very important sector, especially for Indonesia with the huge labor force. We are talking about 125 million labor force in Indonesia. So it's much larger than even the whole Australia for sure. Manufacturing can be a catalyst for improvement of labor productivity, import of the technology, as well as increasing capital accumulation, which is important for a country to growing further and continue in the future. But Indonesia is not one small homogeneous country for sure. Even if you try to divide into two very different regions, Java Island and non-Java Island. This is also not a good description. But Java Island is actually contributing significantly to the economy in Indonesia. If you look at the Java Island in the past before, the Java Island has a much more diversified economy, in which manufacturing sector contributing almost 30%, that is 28% of the total economy. But non-Java Island is actually have a much lower contribution of the manufacturing sector, meaning Sumatra, Kalimantan, Sulawesi, and also Papua, to some extent, they are all very much dominating, sometimes with only a few economic activity, mostly commodity-based. So you can see that in the Indonesian economic development, when commodity boom, this outside Java Island enjoy to some extent, but still the benefits mostly enjoy still with also Java Island. Non-Java Island enjoy a little bit, but not all of them. And then when the commodity drop, they definitely suffer. Like what we saw in the past 3 years, when the oil, coal, palm oil price dropped. You can see that the contraction happened in Kalimantan and Papua. So we have a dimension of regional as well as sectoral for the Indonesian economy. If we look at what is happening and change in terms of the Indonesian economy in the most recent history of Indonesia, before 97-98, the crisis that hit Indonesia in 97-98 shift the economy almost permanently. And now the question for our policymaker, can we shift back into a much better path in the future? Before 97-98, the average economic growth was 5.9% for 3 decades, from 70 until, or 60 in this case, until 1997. And the manufacturing sector is always contributing much higher. The growth rate of the manufacturing sector in Indonesia before 97-98 crisis was 9.7%. So Indonesia is actually at that time, if you remember the Asian miracle, the tiger of Asia, we are actually classifying as the country which is following the first tiger of Japan, and then followed by Taiwan, Singapore, and then Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia. So we are following the flying geese format. And then we hit by the crisis. After the crisis in 97-98, which is 2 decades ago, the growth in the economy is actually only around 4.7%. Oh, no, 5.3%. But the manufacturing contribution to the economy has been declined very constantly because the growth rate is always lower than the economic growth in general, which is 4.7%. What contributed to that? Productivity in the labor is one very important one. If you look at the graph over here, you can see the red is for the manufacturing. Since 97-98, you can see that the labor productivity declined almost to all sectors, but the red one, the manufacturing, is the lowest. This is a bit irony when Indonesia at the same time adopting, after the 97-98 crisis, a lot of legislation reform, including labor reform. The first time that since President Suharto, we have the free of the labor union, negotiation of the wage, and all related to the both national as well as the regional organization of the labor. So there is quite a lot of increase in terms of the freedom, but not improvement in terms of productivity. And if you look at the education composition of our labor, in which 60% mainly is a junior as primary school graduate, junior high and primary school graduate. You can really see that that's one of the explanation in the form of lower productivity. So we have huge young demography, but they are less educated and less skilled. And this is exactly what is the challenge for all of us, what we call it the human capital challenge. In the last IMF annual meeting, IMF World Bank annual meeting, which was hosted by Indonesia in Bali 3 weeks ago, the World Bank launched the Human Capital Index. I think this is a good initiative by the World Bank to show that human capital getting even more important as not only just the development issue, but also in terms of how you are going to manage the economic direction that can be shared fairly across income group. Globally, actually, we made quite a lot of impressive progress. We have MDG and then transferring into SDG. Reducing poverty by half has been achieved. Some of the MDG has not been achieved. From the human capital side, child mortality has been dropped 50%. 40% fewer children now drop out from primary school. And at least in all countries in the world have one social safety net system. So it's a good progress. But challenges remain. If you talk about now, not just the headline poverty number, we are talking about nutrition. We see that the nutrition and early childhood becoming the attention for many countries, especially also in Indonesia. We are not only talking about participation rate and access to education, both in the primary as well as junior high, but we are talking about the quality of education. Those graduated from primary junior high, not necessarily they are going to be able to be ready for the skilled labor. And combined with that, challenge on the human capital progress, we are facing with the changing of the technology which is happening very rapidly, digital economy. Indonesia, in this human capital index, which is announced by the World Bank, we are having a score at 0.53. If you compare with the low middle income country, we are slightly higher. But if you compare with the middle upper income country, Indonesia is among the lowest. Not bad, but definitely not good. Definitely not good. That's politicians who always say that. Okay. Measured by 3 indicators: survival rate, learning, and health. So probability of survival to age 5, we are among the highest. But if you talk about learning, that is the expected year of learning in school, we are actually still need to be improved. And then if you combine with the test score, harmonized test score, especially then if you look at the PISA score test, Indonesia is still, if you compare with the ASEAN country, is among the lowest. Health, although we have a survival rate from age 15 to 16, which is relatively high, but if you look at the nutrition, for those under 5, stunting, Indonesia among the highest. So you can see it's not like one homogeneous indicator. You can see where the pressure point for the Indonesian economy. Since almost 10 years ago, Indonesia adopted, based on the amendment of our constitution, 20% of our education, 20% of our spending of budget should be dedicated for education. This is really a huge progress. I was finance minister that time when we started with that, and I'm now finance minister. 10 years fast forward, and I have to say that I'm the most disappointed that Indonesia is not making significant progress with the budget which is allocated for education. I mentioned about the PISA score of Indonesia, which is lower. Although I must say, Indonesia making quite remarkable progress since 2012 to 2015, especially on a science score. If you talk with the Ministry of Education in Indonesia, he's always argued there is something wrong with the methodology. But this is always, when you're not having a good score, then you are questioning about data and methodology, just like all of you in here. But if Indonesia increase the PISA score by 100%, actually we will be able to increase per capita growth by 1.85%. So it's very important, this building block on education. It's not just how much you spend, how effective they learn, and how they are going to get the result. Why it is important? Because when we talk about technological change and digital economy, this is a very critical element for a country or economy to be able to utilize, to take this opportunity to then derive into a benefit for the population. When we talk about the digital economy, by definition, it is the range of activity that use digitalized information and knowledge as the key factors of production. This is ADB definition. IMF recognized a very narrow definition of the digital economy. Sometimes has been seen only those who's using the online platform, which is a very narrow, but actually almost all economy now has been digitalized. Why this changing technology and digital economy is important? Because it can create a benefit for people and the economy in general. Efficiency, innovation, and inclusiveness. In Indonesia, we were able to produce a unicorn that is the digital company starting from scratch and become now a global player. Gojek, Bukalapak, Tokopedia, Traveloka. And because our ability to create this unicorn globally, Indonesia now become quite a strong attention of all digital players. We negotiate now with Amazon, who's going to provide or invest in the cloud. Google want to compete. Apple is going to establish the training center in Indonesia. Because even though that I'm just discussing about the quality of education, if you talk about the top 5% of Indonesia educated, they are almost the same quality like the one in Silicon Valley. So, efficiency, innovation, and inclusiveness, for example, like Gojek, many of warung or small medium enterprises who was not connected, or they are connected limitedly with the market, now they become connected almost nationally. In Indonesia, the trend now, everybody drink coffee. In the past, it's only Starbucks. And then we have the Luwak coffee. If you have watched the movie, The Bucket List, Jack Nicholson is the one who described the Luwak coffee in a very, very interesting way. He's the rich guy who almost died and said that, have you ever enjoyed Luwak coffee? And then Morgan Freeman said that, what was this Luwak coffee? The coffee which is produced from the pooing of, and that is the best coffee in the world. So, what I'm saying that now almost all what we call about inclusion, innovation, and even efficiency, lower transaction costs. Everybody can start business anywhere. They just immediately connect to Bukalapak, Tokopedia, to Gojek. You can become a housewife, but at the same time, you just put in your Instagram saying that I can make the best fried chicken in the world. And you are connected immediately with the market, amazingly. 1% mobile penetration can create more than 10,700 jobs. The value of the economy is 640 million. So you can see that the digital economy can really opening up to the new employment. So how the government responded to this, what we call it the Industrial 4.0 revolution. The use of more robotic, automation, artificial intelligence, and cloud that can improve the ability of the economy to move forward in a more efficient way. We've already launched Making Indonesia 4.0 program with the expectation that from this element of industrial revolution, we will be able to capture an upside growth by almost 2%. The manufacturing sector can increase in terms of growth or share in the economy up to 26%, and it can also increase our export by 3 to 5 to 10%, from 3% to 10% of the GDP. And the potential job creation is up to 19 million. The strategy that is outlined by the government, including improving material flow, redesigning industrial zone, increasing human capital, empowering small, medium enterprises, technology investment incentive. We are also creating an ecosystem for the growing innovation and attracting more foreign direct investment and harmonizing our policy and rules, building infrastructure and creating sustainability in terms of the standard. These are all the policy that will require, in a very simple statement, 3 things. Infrastructure, because you can only have this inclusion and efficiency if part of Indonesia will be connected. That's why President Jokowi focusing on the infrastructure development, port, airport, seaport, as well as road, and also a satellite to make sure that we are all connected in a digital way. We also focus on the second, other than infrastructure, in human capital development. And the third is try to improve the regulatory sandbox and improvement of our policy responding to the need of this digital. We also use technology to improve our policy implementation. Many of our social safety net program now has been converted into digital, which is creating financial inclusion. The cash program, which is provided for the lowest 20% of our household, is been now becoming changed to become a non-cash transfer. The subsidy in the form of the cheap rice has been converted into e-warung, that is a digital card that held by the low-income household. We are more and more with this what you call it, digital technology, allowing us to monitor, better target it, and also be more accountable to the people in the design. So if digital economy provide an opportunity, I think I can provide you in many of the study. McKinsey is one, which is providing a very rosy picture of how Indonesia as a country have a huge opportunity if we are able to adopt and make the best use of this digital technology. We will be able to enjoy 150 billion growth by 2025, which is equivalent to almost 10% of our GDP, creating more 3.7 million jobs. If you look at the Indonesia most recent development, the fintech technology, fintech company, in 2012, which is not long ago, we started with only 25 companies. Today, if you ask about how many fintechs, we have more than 235 companies, less than 4 years, less than 6 years. The value of the fintechs has been increased very rapidly from 12 billion into 22 billion, with the growth rate is 15%, much higher than the growth rate of our economy, which is around 5, so triple or 3 times higher. The user of digital payment is now reaching 104 million, and that's why the competition between Uber, Grab, Gojek is very, 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 very high. Who's actually benefiting from this? Is many consumers. My sister just told me one experience. She went in one city in Indonesia for 3 days holiday, and she almost spent 0 rupiah on transportation because of Grab as well as Gojek competing to lower the price with all the discount. I actually discussing this with our Central Bureau of Statistics because I think our inflation is not capturing this discount rate. It's supposed to be much lower on the inflation that we are having. But with all those benefits as well as the promise that we're having with the digital economy, if you look at the Indonesia today, then we immediately recognize the challenge. First, as I mentioned earlier, the education. Indonesia has adopted the right decision on spending significant amount of our budget for education. If you look at the amount of budget that we spend for education, has been increased in the past 10 years. For next year budget, which is just approved by the parliament last week, we will spend next year half of 1,000 trillion or 495 trillion rupiah. Part of it is actually for the scholarship program. We established what we call it the Sovereign Education Wealth Fund, which is now reaching 62 trillion rupiah, that we were able to spend and providing scholarship to more than 18,000 students. And I'm sure some of you sitting here, and I'm going to have lunch with many of the students of the LPDP. You are the one who enjoy a very clear benefit of the government spending on education. I do hope that you are going to come back to Indonesia and improve the education quality of Indonesian in general. We also spend 5% of our spending for health. We are still in the early stage of building the universal health coverage system in Indonesia. We have a teething problem in terms of how much everyone should contribute, who should receive the subsidy, how we are going to manage the universal health coverage, the relationship between BPJS and Minister of Health, and what is the policy between local and national government. A lot of dimension, but it's a good problem, because it's showing that we are going to the right direction, but it's not immediately everything can be solved. I do hope many of you is going to make a dissertation on this, that is going to then can be used. At least you are going to have a good data. If health and education is most important, we also need to redesign our social safety net. During the discussion in the G20 finance minister and central bank governor, a lot of discussion about the digital economy and how we as a policymaker need to prepare ourselves. The dimension about the disruption of digital economy in the labor market is so obvious. The question is whether that's going to happen. Automatization, robot, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things. But the question is how fast they are coming and how prepared we are going to be able to make sure that disruption is not going to be too costly socially and politically. I was attending the OECD discussion, and one Minister of Finance from Ireland telling me about a very important dimension of this digital economy. One kampung or village in Ireland has been disrupted because of this digital economy. They were producing fruit and vegetable, and now people prefer to buy it from other parts of Europe through the digital economy. So the minister facing a very real issue, how this one village people have to convert their job. This disruption may be easier to analyze on the data, but when you talk about human dimension, social, it's going to be very complicated. The debate about whether we need to establish a universal social safety net or unemployment benefit, so everybody will be paid regardless, and let robot pay the tax. Robot is going to be the one who work, and they pay the tax for us. We don't know. I don't know whether you are a fan of many of those movies about cyborg and all those things, but maybe you need to start watching those movies in order for you to have at least an imagination what is going to happen in the next 10 to 12 to 20 years from now. I'm not making you, creating you the scare scenario, but this is a real discussion among finance minister and central bank governor. When we discuss about how we are going to design taxation, who should pay tax, where the location of tax. When we talk about income tax versus value-added tax, I think even in this country, Australia, I think every state is also quarreling about who should pay tax where. Because I think the online, it could be the production as well as the owner of the company in Perth, but the consumer in Sydney. So who will get the tax when and what kind of fair taxation? It's a real debate, a current and ongoing, and no one can say what is going to be the outcome. But Indonesia need to invest, and I ask the Minister of Finance of Indonesia to invest on both Fiscal Policy Office as well as our tax office and custom office, that they need to understand this trend. When we talk about social safety net, Indonesia has already invested and have built quite robust social safety net. As I said earlier, the declining Gini ratio and reducing poverty is showing that we actually have put in place the right policy. But the challenge is going to be more than that. What is going to be the social safety net design that will combine between the good trend on the poverty reduction and reducing inequality with this disruption that will be anticipated? Minister of Labor is already floating the idea about unemployment benefit. Can we afford, as a developing country, who will pay for that benefit? What is the fair taxation? What is the fair benefit? And how we are going to make sure that the investment in education is going to achieve the result. So this is the policy discussion as well as policy issue which is really real. Indonesia is investing quite a lot, and we will continue pay an important and highest priority for this issue. Human capital quality is important. How we are going to make sure and improve the education. We've already now touching the issue of quality of curriculum and quality of teacher. One of the unicorn in Indonesia is somebody who created Ruang Guru. This is a digital company which try to solve the problem of uneven teacher quality so that any student from Indonesia can get the access of best quality teacher online. So even if you are in a remote area in Indonesia, which is usually the quality of school is not good, if you have a connection, then you are going to be able to then always access the good quality of teacher as well as curriculum. This is all the example of how technology can also provide solution. We are also now focusing on giving a training, vocational training, so that people is not only just graduated from the general study, but they are going to have more skill. But reskilling is also important. Singapore is one of the countries who's now trying to introduce what they call it the lifetime education system. So education should not be only limited to the what you call it a formal education. From the day the inception of the baby up to the day that you are going to be buried, these are all the time span that you have to be able to continue learning. It's always fascinating to see Singapore because it's a small country that they always can think 10 times ahead for everything. So for Indonesia, we can just enjoy those ideas and we convert it rapidly. It's not plagiarism. It's just policy lesson and learn. And of course, we have to be able to make sure that we will continue to develop a policy as well as regulation that is favorable and in response to this challenge. So in closing, I was saying that Indonesia has achieved quite a lot of remarkable achievement in the development. The macroeconomic soundness, a prudent fiscal policy, credibility of the framework. You should really appreciate that, because if I always talk about the finance minister and budget in Indonesia, I'm less appreciated. And I look at the Europe that they are having bigger deficit, bigger debt, and it seems like they're enjoying themselves a lot. But in Indonesia, it's much more disciplined and more sensitive on that, which is good. It's creating quite a lot of strong. So macroeconomic soundness, attention to the structural issue, and have all the intention as well as the implementation. So the challenge for Indonesia now, delivery, as well as coordination between national and local government. Because if you talk about human capital in Indonesia, most of education and health function has been delegated to the local level government. But we are in the right direction, right attention, a good issue, and also the right response. I do hope that we will continue to do the right thing. Thank you so much.
Well, Minister, thank you. As promised, we have plenty of time for questions. We do, I think, have, yes, microphones. So if you could please raise your hands and the microphone will come to you. Say who you are.
Thank you very much for your speech, Minister. I'm Angus Livingston. I'm a reporter from Australian Associated Press. I just wanted to see if I could cheekily sneak two questions into one. You talked about education a lot. The Australian-Indonesia Free Trade Deal contains provisions for getting more Australian universities into Indonesia and opening up there. I wanted to ask you how important it is that those universities open up quickly in Indonesia to try and transform the education sector there, and also on a political side, how damaging or how important were Australia's recent moves to move the embassy in Israel to that free trade deal? Thank you very much.
You reserve the right to answer the questions you wish.
Okay. We have President Jokowi is this is not campaign, so don't report me to the Bawaslu again. No, President Jokowi is just remarkable when he always outlined about how important our Indonesia interaction with the global world, especially importing idea, capital, and innovation. He firmly believed that opening the country is going to make us better. He gave an example which is very, very effective. When Indonesia closed in terms of the financial sector, banking sector, as well as the downstream oil services like the SPBU, what is the English side? Pompa bensin, gas station. These are all monopoly by the role of our state-owned enterprises is very, very obvious. And then since 2 decades ago, this openness, especially after the 97-98 crisis, we opened the banking system, we also opened on a gas station on a downstream, so upstream as well as downstream. And you can see that what is happening is always good. The people in the past always go to the gas station. I don't know whether many of you Indonesian old enough, but I'm old enough. Many of you are still young. But in the past, I still have a memory that if we go to the gas station, the situation is always dirty. The people is just serving as they like. If happen to be in between city, you want to go to the toilet, this is totally disaster. You don't want to go there, but you don't have any other option. And all those things, I can explain you so many very detailed, because that is our real experience. When we open to the competition now, almost all gas station is becoming clean, efficient, a nice place for everyone to just drop by, buying snack, or even. It's only because we have Petronas, the BP, and then they give a real example how to run a gas station. Then the state-owned enterprise says, oh, there is a better idea to run a gas station. Then they are going to that. The same thing like the banking. So presidents always use this example saying that openness is important because you never know whether you are actually achieving your maximum best capacity unless you actually open and compete with others. In education, it's the same. So actually, in a couple of the discussion in the cabinet, you have a very important, interesting idea. First, he's floating the idea. The president of university in Indonesia is always Indonesian. Is elected among all the faculty members and so on. And I think, well, you know, maybe I should change. If I can appoint the president of university, somebody's coming from outside Indonesia, and everybody like drop their jaw, huh? Seriously? President was not a professor. He's just a regular business from the medium-sized company. So he knows exactly how Indonesia suffers so many things coming from the status quo policy, only because we don't have the ability to think or we don't want to go from the status quo to the new thing. That's including opening to the foreign university to Indonesia. Of course, you can immediately see the resistance. Unfortunately, we still faced with the hurdle. By law, it's very difficult for us to open the foreign university in Indonesia. But he didn't give up. Say, okay, if we use the law like the investment law, in which we have the economic zone, but this economic zone is for education. So we are going to create a zone. This is the education zone. So the foreign university can invest there. I think that's a good idea. I have to say that I now, especially when facing with the current account deficit and trade account, many of the Indonesian relatively middle income, they are sending almost all their children here in Australia. So you're the one who actually creating current account deficit to us. We've already established a sovereign wealth fund. I think we sent more than 1,247 graduate students here. Seems like everybody enjoying themselves. But that means that I have to pay in Australian dollar. So if you are going to be coming to Indonesia, I don't have to pay, maybe in dollars still. But maybe I can recruit more faculty members from Indonesia to be there. And you are going to be able to expand. So yes, I think on your question about that, it is actually important and it can transform. On your second question, why don't I defer it to my ambassador? Okay, because he knows the politics here as well as Indonesia, and his job is actually try to handle this kind of question.
Okay, who'd like to ask the next question? The lady here in the peach jacket. Yes, you. It's coming down that way.
Thank you for the presentation, Dr Sri Mulyani. I'm one of the students benefited from the Sovereign Wealth Fund Education Policy
Very good.
Initiative, so I'm very grateful for that. My question is related to 2003 labor law. Of course, it's about the hiring and firing policy. Indonesia has one of the highest severance payment. We touch on how Indonesia wants to improve the manufacturing growth, and then how the social security landscape has also changed. We're going to have universal healthcare not really tied to employment, and you also mentioned about the unemployment benefit that now the policymaker is thinking about. But how relevant is the severance payment in the current landscape, and what's the government stance on it? Is the government going to reform maybe after the election when it's more politically doable? Thanks for that.
Well, labor policy and law, as I said, that we just produced after 97-98 crisis, was responding to what is perceived, or not only perceived, but also the implementation of repressive labor market during President Suharto. In the new order under President Suharto, labor, I think you are still very young, if you are old enough again, you still memory of this Marsina. if you have any protests, labor union, expression, freedom of expression, I think that was not the case. So Indonesia has become a place which is attracting many FDI at the cost of labor. It's not at the benefit of labor, but at the cost of labor. I think to some extent, theoretically, from the economic point of view, you always want to see that productivity should reflect the quality of income or salary or benefit from this labor. So when we swing from the very repressive labor market, labor policy, labor law into a freedom after 97-98, reformasi, then you have the mechanism, freedom of union, freedom of expression, negotiated wage rate, minimum wage rate, as well as the severance payment, as you mentioned earlier. Definitely that swing from here to there, this is at the cost of now investors. The problem in this case, investor can choose. If this is not favorable from all my return on investment, then I always can put my capital to Vietnam, to Sri Lanka. So then you end up with maybe a policy which is intended good for the labor, but it's only good for those who already employed in the formal sector. So if you are already employed, you are very much protected. This is good, but unfortunately, this is a thin layer of labor. Most of the labor, 125 million, is the informal and they are seeking for job. Because for company, in order for them to hire, they know that once I sign yes for this employment, there is a consequence. Then they're becoming very, very, very careful. And that's why the labor mobility is becoming very slow. So this has been discussed quite a lot during the cabinet, as well as the discussion about how the policy need to be improved. First, if you cannot change the law, because it's also a requirement of the political process, you have to focus on catching up the productivity. Wage is already increased, but productivity is not following. So how we are going to be able to invest more so that the productivity can be catching up to this. But ideally, we should have a much more balanced treatment of both sides. So meaning that you are going to be able to have within labor, those who's already employed and those who will be employed. There should be a balance about the need. Open competition and healthy competition is required. You also need to have a balance between labor and capital owners. I think this is one of the most contentious issues in any country in the world. I'm not saying about Australia. I don't know about the politics here. But I'm sure this has become one of the issues, the debate in many other, of how you try. Because for me, responding to that question, my answer is going to be normative. Should be balance and harmony. That's it. But if you ask me as a minister, how? Then that is going to be something. We are going to continue reforming the labor market, discussion tripartite between government, investors or capital owners, and labor union is ongoing. We identify what is in the labor law that need to be revised, and that will really require both drafting and then political process in the parliament. So we will see, of course, this is one of the top important policy that will creating a much more, what you call it, a vibrant, but most importantly, it's not only creating a vibrant, if we are able to address the issues so that there will be no disparity within the labor market, as well as addressing the issue which is more important, that is improving productivity of the labor force in Indonesia, I think that's going to be the most important one. Thank you.
Just here. Yeah, I'm coming over here, don't worry. We've got time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sri Mulyani. My name is Sarah Dong from ANU. So I just have a question about the digital economy. I just wonder whether the government has a plan to systematically collect data about digital economy. So for example, we'll know how many businesses participate in the economy and how many people are employed in the digital economy. Thank you.
As I mentioned earlier, even with the discussion with the Central Bureau of Statistics, this is still relatively new phenomenon. As I said, that many of them is starting in 2012, and like fintechs, and then the digital economy, I think they started relatively also very young. So the data is actually one which is very important. I mean, in the digital economy, data and data protection and who should own what kind of access, I think this is one of the big issue. And Central Bureau of Statistics just initiated a survey starting last year. So we actually still in a very early stages of how we can systematically managing, following, monitoring, as well as then governing those data. So it is starting with the design of how you are going to compare the conventional, traditional economic activity with those which is converted into digital. Even when we talk about retail sector in Indonesia, 2 years ago, I have huge political pressure because headline of some news in Indonesia is saying that one of the big retail shopping in Indonesia is closed. Matahari closed how many outlets? Ramayana closed many outlets. But they never actually look how much Gojek accessing more than 500,000 small medium enterprises now become a regular supplier. If you look at my tax revenue until today, trade as well as information and technology, communication, the revenue is always double digit, close to 20%. Meaning that they are not going to pay tax unless they have economic activity. But this is not yet captured in the composition of the economy yet because of what I mentioned about the statistic. So Indonesia is still in a very early stage to try to understand this dynamic, but we are going to hopefully can be systematically addressing those issues. Thank you.
Okay, just here, please.
Hello, Ibu. My name is Kevin. Sadly, I'm not part of your beneficiaries because
It's good, David.
From the Australian Awards, so it's sad because I would like to have lunch with you. So my question.
You can ask Mario to be invited if only having a lunch.
My question is pretty simple, and actually it's related to my experience, before coming here. So you talk a lot about openness, e-commerce, and we know that Indonesia in 2017, which passed our e-commerce roadmap, in which it contains a lot of stipulations, regulations, and everything. And one of the most interesting regulations that I noticed from the roadmap is the National Payment Gateway. So National Payment Gateway is something that I wouldn't consider something that is open, because what it does is basically it rules out companies like MasterCard and Visa from Indonesia, because the regulation requires 80% of local ownership. So in the era of Indonesia's growth of economy, digital economy, we might want to absorb as much as information, as much as technology that is available in the world. And as you mentioned earlier, we can connect not only Indonesian economy, but also international economy with the presence of those companies. So in regards of good policy framework for the growth of Indonesian digital economy, do you think that the National Payment Gateway is the right way to go forward with Indonesia? Thank you.
David, appreciate that question. First, the way the government of Indonesia approaching this issue. Since this is a totally new phenomenon, no one or no country actually knows exactly what needs to be done. And even in this case, you are all mostly in academic, but if you are as a policymaker, this ability to always divine between what you call it the sovereignty without becoming nationalistic inward looking, but sovereignty is definitely, it's why you become Indonesia or why you become Australia. There's always a boundary in this case. President Trump is even very closing the boundary in this case. Even for America, US, which is very mighty and very powerful, he needs to define sovereignty. So if you become a policymaker, you definitely have to find the right balance about how you are going to continue developing the attitude of proud to be Indonesia, knows your identity as an Indonesia without being a close-minded or close policy in which, as I mentioned earlier, even President Jokowi has a quite very open and want to engage globally. Now, within that context, many of our policy is actually what we are doing or what we are adopting is an open, pragmatic one. By being open, meaning that you look at all other countries, you don't have to look at 192 countries, of course. In a digital economy, you look at who's the supplier and who's the emerging country. Indonesia will be comparable to maybe China and India, although they have 1.5 billion population, we only 260 million. That is one. So we always compare ourselves about that domestic market is important because we are the 4th largest populous country in the world and growing middle class. Second, we also as a G20 and also now starting OECD inviting Indonesia as always an observer or what is the status, Pak Swa? Huh? Strategic partner. We are the strategic partner of the OECD, whatever that definition is. But this is the rich country club. They call it, OECD always say that they are rich country club. So for us, when we define this kind of policy, we look at what is the position of the G20? What is this, the OECD? What is their best practice? In fact, when we have to negotiate with the investor, with this, all the big company in the digital, which is only a few. And by the way, David, you also know that the discussion about the digital economy, the issue about competition and fair competition is very real. I think in the United States, everybody's scared that Amazon is going to like swallow all others in this case. So the discussion about fair competition in which the digital economy is always have the tendency to expand the market share, wiping out your competition is very real. So for us, actually really finding the right balance, what works, what does not work, and what is still in progress. So national payment gateway, just to correct you, it doesn't mean that if Indonesia have the NPG that we are not connected or MasterCard, Visa cannot operate. I think Bank Indonesia tried to establish what he called it as a practice, which is finding the right balance between what we could control, especially on the data, location data protection. But if you are in NPG, it does not mean that you are not connected with the global. It's just where the transactions should be administered. So I think this is just a fair development in terms of how Indonesia is going to continue. I do understand that in the past, what is Bank Indonesia mentioned, that for Indonesia, if I'm using my Indonesian banking card, let's say Bank Mandiri or BNI, and I pay for using my credit card, the SWIFT is have to go to United States and then going back. The fee is actually paid in the United States. This is pure transaction in which I buy something in my own country, and then you have to go down there. I think that is something which can be easily identified, that you can have a better arrangement on that. So that's my answer. Hopefully that answered your question.
Okay, we'll move over here. I think we should give the people sitting on the stairs a chance, given that sitting on the stairs is probably uncomfortable. So the gentleman there in the blue jumper, yes, you, sir. The microphone's on its way.
Hello. Hi, my name is Aditya. I'm an IT consultant that work for the government department here. Just questions about the looming trade wars between major countries like US and China, and then also the movement to actually close the economy like Brexit. How would Indonesia respond to it? Because that will affect the trade surpluses. Obviously, we are already under pressure on that one. Thank you.
So your first question is about the China-US relation and how it is affect Indonesia, is it?
The trade wars.
The trade war. If we look at the number, it's not really affecting that much. Meaning that if you talk about the supply chains, Indonesia happened to be the country who's a little bit like behind on the supply chains. So the US-China trade relation will hit directly on the supply chains for those companies who actually have the relationship with China in terms of the production. And this is mostly like Malaysia, some of country, Thailand to some extent. They are more affected with that. But the issue is beyond supply chains correlation or connection in this case. It's more psychology, as well as uncertainty about what kind of trade dispute and trade settlement that can be governed or that will govern the global economy. I think that's much more fundamental issue. If country is powerful enough, and then you can say that, well, I don't like WTO, this is my rule now. If a country can say that, well, now the regime is going to be a fair trade, and what is fair? Fair is according to my interpretation. Then that is creating a huge uncertainty about what kind of multilateralism, because, like it or not, global economy, they are all connected. Dispute is always happen. Even you are friendly neighbor like Australia, Indonesia, there is always dispute. Impossible. So what needs to be done when the country is open and engaged and relate to each other is the ability of the global economy to agree on what kind of dispute settlement that need to be agreed and governed. And this is exactly maybe the most important implication of this trade war. The US, as the champion of the globalization in the past, suddenly they now become a country that say that I have my own system, I have my own. So you ask me about what is going to happen, I don't know. You should ask political analysts, and I think everybody will give you 101 possibilities. So we'll see, because I think even within the administration, they really want to see whether Mr. Trump heading to this midterm election with a Twitter habit is going to be able to outline what is the direction of policy. So we'll see, but we definitely, all countries in the world will concern about that. But that's not really always negative. What you see, for example, like Canada and Mexico reach an agreement with the United States is showing that the US can be also very pragmatic in terms of what they see as benefiting their interests, which is not always zero-sum game. This has changed in terms of attitude from the very beginning, that they always see that deficit meaning it is a zero-sum game. If I'm deficit, somebody taking advantage of me. Now it's changing. So I think this is a good. So we do hope that the next is going to be US-Euro and US-Japan, and then maybe US-China. I think they are starting and discussing and even mentioning that during the G20 leaders meeting in Argentina, they are going to be able to come up with at least a discussion on that. On the Brexit, maybe Australia is more expert than me in terms of following Brexit. I don't know, when I ask them, they also don't know what is the answer, because these are all these are all about politics in a way. I mean, when you vote for exit, but you're not ready to exit, and you cannot define what does exit mean to you, so let them have their political process and confusion, and we'll wait. Some of what when was that? I have a meeting, was that 2 days ago, with some of the German minister who visited Indonesia, and I said, what is going to be the outlook? And this is not to be quoted because we have the EP, well, I'm not going to say then. Okay. This is media. Okay. What I'm saying is that they don't know. Okay. Okay.
I think that's a very safe answer. Yes.
Hi there, Minister. Thank you so much for your speech. My name's Primrose and I'm a reporter from The Australian.
Okay.
I
A lot
know
of
you-
media here.
You did invite us, so.
I have to be very careful from the very beginning. This is totally wrong strategy. Okay. Okay.
I know you didn't want to address the embassy issue, but it does have some economic consequences potentially between the two countries. And I just wondered whether or not you could offer any reassurances that the signing of the deal between the two countries won't be delayed if Australia does proceed with moving its embassy in Israel.
I think that's the kind of question that the minister's probably not going
Pak
to
DCM
answer.
want to help me? Pak Dubes?
Okay, I think we'll...
Yeah.
There was a... Yes, you.
My name is Diane. I'm from University of Canberra. I raised my hands 5 times until I got. My concern is about, you mentioned that digital-based economy contributes to economic growth, but I reckon that some of the vendors, they don't register formally. Sometimes they just use social media, and we cannot trace the transaction. And the high profit margin from this transaction is huge, because you can sell everything in social media. You can sell iPhone, you can sell Victoria Beckham handbag. And I wondered if Ministry of Finance has developed a regulation or policy about how to collect taxation and how to make tax compliance from these vendors. Thank you very much.
Our discussion with the online company, I think they are more or less, especially they become bigger and become responsible player. I think they're fully aware that they have to comply. And we also have already launched the reduction on the income tax for the small company into half. This is just to show that Indonesia is actually want to have what is the word of the president is a light touch of what is the growing and the direction of the economy with the digital and information technology. But I also know that at the same time, as a policymaker, you really have to juggle and find the right balance, because the conventional business player, they also want to have the fair competition, because for those of you who's going to the online, or even in this case you mentioned about social media, they actually not paying tax, or what they perceive of not paying tax. Although they, for the online company, they pay tax. And I think in terms of enforcement, it's much easier because they are all recorded. Different from the informal sector, in which you cannot record everything in digital economy or have a digital footprint, so you actually can always record to that. Now, the phenomena of the social media as a platform to sell and to buy, I think this is also relatively new, and we need to really look at it more. If you look at the millennial, this is part of their lifestyle. Many of them, they no longer go to the mall shopping area. They even enjoy part of it. I mean, if you want to have a clothes or even shoes or a bag, they want to make sure that there is only 3 bags in the world that is like this. It doesn't matter the brand name, but they know that this is only 3. And that is something is more like a retail inclusion in this case, but reaching out, I think it's going to be really a challenge. To be able to come up with a response, first, just want to make sure that this excitement to use this platform is continued there, because it's better than totally unknown in this case. The next is certainly that Minister of Finance, especially Tax Office and Fiscal Policy, you should ask this gentleman with the yellow tie. He's the one who's actually can answer all your question and all those questions. Because he's my brain. He's the Fiscal Policy Office. So I'm just the speaker, the brain is over there.
And the timekeeper is just giving me some very stern looks too. So,
we are moving on that direction, and we'll continue studying and learning about how big, how significant, and how we should approach that.
Okay, so if I may, I know we won't have time for all of your questions. If it's okay with you, Minister, if I take a couple together, and then
that's good. Yeah.
And then we will finish.
It's by design that I answer very long so that I don't have to get another question.
Okay, you, sir, I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were waiting to ask a question. Yeah.
Okay. Hello, ma'am, a pleasure. I'm a PhD student here, also as funded, so I'm not hurting your balance of payment. But we know that investing in, you just mentioned about Shell and Petrogas investing here attract retail jobs. But like university require different human resource, or even programmer seats needs to be filled with people with different ability than retail, like selling gas. What do you think about the movement of people across border? And what can you do as the Ministry of Finance about that? Thank you.
Can you give the microphone to Peter, please?
Second.
Yeah,
No,
just
this one?
in front of you.
Yeah.
There we go. And then we'll go up here, and then we'll come to you, Peter.
Yes, here, Crawford. I want to ask a big macro question. We've been reminded in the discussion of the risks, external risks that face not only Indonesia but us all. The Indonesian economy is travelling very well, as you've explained, though it has some deep structural reform challenges. 2 big risks externally are the tightening of the international capital market and the response to that, and the shock that could come through the real economy because of, as you described it, the incredible uncertainties in international economic policy that derive from policy uncertainty out of Washington. The response to that in Indonesia, both fronts, building up the resilience of the Indonesian economy, and the necessary complement to that is building up the resilience of the arrangements to protect against a financial crisis. On the real shock risk, I guess the most important and pressing issue is to double down on regional integration, to pursue as deeply as you possibly can reforms externally that will relate to the structural reforms, including in respect to digitalisation, that will prosecute productive growth in Indonesia and the region. So that's RCEP, but it's also the AEC agenda. So my question really is, Indonesia is so central to both responses. The strategy going forward, what's Indonesia's commitment to response, strategic response on both these fronts to these 2 big external risks?
Do you have time for just one more?
Yeah.
Yes, my name is Bayu. I would like to ask a very practical question. If the government want to increase the human capital, one of the most important thing is to control the consumption, and cigarette is the second highest consumption after rice. So we have the lowest price of cigarette in the world. My question is really simple. Will you increase the tax of cigarette until 50,000? Because it will reduce the cigarette consumption to around 75%. Thank you.
Yeah. I think the first questions try to say that the business of the petroleum retail with the university is different. Should we design the same policy on the openness and so on? And you asked about what is my thinking about the movement of people. I think human being is a social creature. So engagement is part to become a better human being. I mean, within Indonesia, globally. So I always firmly believe that getting engaged, understand differences, how to address the issue of differences is part of to become a better and a stronger countries. Indonesia is a very diverse country, so Indonesia cannot afford to become an inward-looking, one homogeneous type of, what you call it, race, religious, and others, ethnic. And that's why I think engagement within the ASEAN, we have ASEAN Economic Community, we have the East Asian, including Australia, New Zealand. I think this is good. It's create a good platform and step for us to getting engaged, establish relations which can create also mutual benefit for all countries. I have one note for that also. If you look at what is happening today about the anti-globalization, it's actually just giving a very real message for policymakers and even maybe for the academician like many of you here. When you think that all the openness, globalization, free trade is always good, but we never address the issue of loser. We always think that globalization, openness is going to create efficiency, productivity, improvement, competition is good. But don't forget that in all this choice, policy choice, there is always a loser. And in the past, we always think that the loser can take care of themselves. And that's not the case. They can take care of themselves and they can vote then. And that is the voter, which is then electing the leaders. So I think we need to learn more about how to address the benefit of openness, competition, and globalization, while at the same time also have an effective policy in addressing those issues who cannot actually include or participate in a level playing field. On the second question, well, what we as an Indonesia learns from the ASEAN financial crisis, our own crisis, and then 2008, 2009, we are now putting in place all what you call it, the legislation and institutional framework that allow us to have a much better, effective policy response as well as arrangement when we deal with shock or potential crisis. We have the financial sector safety net policy, law as well as policy. Indonesia has been seen as a very few country who regularly creating a stress test to our banking and non-banking institution in order for us to identify the vulnerability and testing how fast and how effective the institution who in charge for this financial stability, Ministry of Finance, Central Bank, as well as OJK, that is Financial Sector Authority, and Deposit Insurance Institution, to work together to make sure that we are able to identify the potential crisis, to do the stress test, and even in this case, put some scenario and what if happen, what kind of decision and response need to be done. So we on that, I think Indonesia is learned from 97, 98, and 2008, 2009. Of course, shock could happen in any time, in any place, in any form, and that is something that no one can really we just see the trend. The United States with their policy, are they going to continue in the next 5 years? China with the rebalancing, what does it mean in terms of regional and global economy? Geopolitical question, North Korea in the past, now we are talking about Saudi now. We are talking about oil price. So we always have, and constantly, as I mentioned to all my team in the Ministry of Finance, what I think is different from what I experienced 12 years ago when I was finance minister. Today, we are forced by the technology and so on to have what we call it 24/7 body contact policymaker, meaning that you are dealing with social media, you're talking with the capital market, you are talking about bond market, you're talking about President Trump, Twitter, we talk about so many. So these are like 24/7 that we really need to understand and have the right response. So Indonesia is also participating in ASEAN Economic Community, the integration, and I think we are following the path and preparing ourselves hopefully better and more effective in dealing with that. On the last question, if you look at the Indonesian cigarette price, maybe hopefully that you are not comparing nominal to nominal, because then you are talking about McDonald's in Canberra with McDonald's in Indonesia. You're talking about nasi uduk in Indonesia and nasi uduk in here. What I'm saying, when you talk about the price of cigarette in Indonesia, at the nominal level, maybe you see it the lowest. But if you talk with the income per capita, Indonesia is actually the less affordable. We are at the 11% comparing. Indonesia is always constantly, and this is maybe the toughest job, you always compare immediately with Singapore. Singapore is $75,000 per capita with 5 million population. We, Indonesia, 257 million with almost 4,000 per capita. So if harga cigarette in Singapore, you call it 50,000, and in Indonesia now around 26,000. If you combine with the income per capita of Singapore, Singapore is very cheap. Even with that, Singapore still like to buy cigarette in Batam, smuggling. That's because So what I'm saying that in divining and designing the policy on this exercise, as a policymaker, you always have to deal with many aspects or elements of the policy. Health is for sure important, but at the same time, you also deal with labor and farmer. That is the cloth as well as tobaccos farmers. You are dealing with the company which is small. It's not always the big like BAT but you're dealing also with the smaller. So how we are going to be able to transform them to become more, what we call it, this is a sunset industry. You have to be able, just what I just mentioned earlier. The easiest way is just think that, well, you have to close, goodbye, good luck. You have to do it your own. That's not the way the policy works. So in policy, you really have to make sure that there is a transition. Sometimes we design transition because this is exactly what I did 12 years ago as a finance minister, how you are going to train the tobacco farmer and cloth farmer to become more like a coffee farmer, because coffee is less dangerous than cigarette for sure. So they are going to be like able to have a more alternative. And then also, if this is becoming just, you do the right combination so that you are going to be able to transform. And this is exactly what we are doing. Thank you so much for all the attention.
So, Minister, that was a tour de force, both of exposition with the lecture, but then handling a huge range of questions. It seems to me that the theme that you reminded us of consistently was the importance of connecting, both connecting digitally in a way that we can't ignore, but also connecting as countries and as academics and policymakers who are all engaged in trying to achieve sustainable outcomes for people. So thank you so much for your presence here today, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you back here again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.